For Real News is sponsored by assholes like you, so pay up, motherfucker. Is political violence unacceptable, or is it part of achieving the end of any struggle? Is it the means to achieving the end of your struggle? Is it a way of getting to your goal? That is a question that's been plaguing people in politics and all across sociology and related fields for a long time. By the way, I'm wearing these glasses probably more to kill the glare than to look cool. And I believe that's a legitimate means to the end here. But I think that when it comes to the Real News Network, they follow the same pattern as the rest of the left when it comes to using political violence. When other people are doing it, when you see right-wing people or just average people of all political persuasions buying firearms and calling for the lifting of gun control laws, they call it the arming of a militia. They claim that it is the beginning of a racial decline in America. And there's some understandable elements of it. In the 19th century, black people were victimized by average citizens that would, they would hire private patrols to track down slaves. Mormons were also killed by mob violence. Indians were also killed by private citizens, the Indian killers. So it's not as if they don't have a precedent. And this is to set the stage here. I'm bringing a little balance here. However, we've seen the other extreme become just as brutal and terrifying. What happens in these countries where the private citizen does not have firearms or access to firearms? The ability to purchase firearms is probably the best way to put it. That is a good question. You can go to many of these countries where that has happened, and you'll see that in the end, other means were taken in order to bring about the fall of that regime. Throughout Eastern Europe, personal ownership of firearms was not legal. You can go throughout the Western world, some of the countries with the hardest gun control laws. You can go to Mexico, you can go to Colombia, you can go to Brazil. They have some of the worst gun crime in the world. And why is that? I can tell you personally that I know from the people that I meet and the profession that I'm in that you cannot uninvent the firearms. People will find a way to produce them and to attack people that they have a problem with for whatever reason. It could be a criminal reason, and it could be a crime of passion, and that's just a part of life. But what happens when we take firearms and in general violence and we turn it into a question of political motive? Can you really claim that you are nonviolent and that you believe in peace and civil society? Well, I have to tell you that I believe if you think that, you have to stay consistent. You have to be a pacifist all the way. And I'm not willing to do that. I believe people have the legitimate right to firearms. I don't think that the Real News Network is being consistent about that. And I'll show you a few cases of why I think that's true. On July 10th, the Real News aired this segment that documented a KKK march in Virginia, in Charlottesville, where the Klan attempted to prevent the removal of some Confederate statues, including that of General Robert E. Lee, who is the most famous Virginian and Confederate figure in the Civil War. Let's ignore the fact that the Real News left out the large number of protesters that were for removal of the statue in Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. Their coverage depends almost entirely on racializing any single topic. Now, you might be correct in saying that it's very hard to racialize the KKK any more than the KKK does. But watch as they project the Ku Klux Klan, which is a group of mostly elderly and rural people who have not had influence in the United States since the 60s, they're portraying them as some sort of existential threat to this country. I can tell you that when I was a kid, there was KKK that would march up to my hometown every year. They would perform in front of some barriers. People would watch. People would yell abuse at them, and then they would go home. And that was about it. So what's the whole point of this sensational coverage about a group of people who may look incredibly ignorant and very bigoted? What's the point of blowing this out of proportion? In fact, their whole problem has been that they claim that their heritage is being destroyed. Well, to some extent, are you not giving them a reason to come out and march by removing their statue? Robert E. Lee survived the Civil War, and he lived a peaceful life afterwards. And it was as a result of our ability to end the war between states, as imperfect as the ending was, and as many as abuses occurred after the war due to the remaining residual Southern bigotries against the blacks, we could not have continued to fight the Civil War after it had already been fought. That's not the way that functioning democracies in the Western world have solved their problems. So let's watch as they document a little more of their viewpoint about why the KKK is so important today.
Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morse Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of many books, most recently, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, and the Origins of the United States of America. Thanks so much for joining us again.
So let's talk a little bit more about the background of this Professor Gerald Horne. I did a little digging about him, and he's made a few interesting statements about the role of historians. This is a speech given on April 6, 2007, as shown on the screen, that has been republished in People's World, which is a communist publication by none other than Gerald Horne. And it says, Rethinking the History and Future of the Communist Party. He says, the thrust of my brief remarks is to suggest that the history of the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States of America, and indeed the global movement of which it is a part, has been distorted grievously by the infestation of anti-Sovietism and anti-communism, and the opening of these wonderful archives should not only lead to a reassessment of the party, but help to push back the right wing, which has profited so handsomely from anti-Sovietism and anti-communism forces, which have brought this nation to the brink of catastrophe, not only in Iraq and the Middle East, but generally, but vis-a-vis China as well. I suggest in these remarks that future generations will not necessarily be as seized as this one apparently is with how and why the former USSR was a supposed evil empire, and how and why some in the US, such as the CPUSA, could support this state. I think future generations in the US will take note of the fact that the presumed primary victims of the so-called evil empire in Soviet Russia, for example, tend to agree with President Putin, whose popularity ratings are about double those of the current U.S. president, in his assertion that the fall of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So we see here, remember, this was an accusation made against Donald Trump, that he was bashing Obama by claiming that Vladimir Putin is more popular than him. Well, here you see, this was from 2007, Gerald Horne was claiming that Vladimir Putin was more popular than President Bush. So there we go. He says, let me begin by quoting the fortunately retired New York Times right-wing hack columnist William Safire. Before Nixon died, he said, I asked him on the record if perhaps we had gone a bit overboard on selling the American people on the political benefits of increased trade with China. The old realist, continued Safire, who had played the China card to exploit the split in the communist world, replied with some sadness that he was not as hopeful as he had once been. We may have created a Frankenstein monster, said Nixon. Nixon, the hard-boiled realist, was on to something, for although contemporary analysts have managed to convince the chattering class in this nation that the former Soviet Union collapsed of its own weight and that China's role in the encirclement of Russia had little or nothing to do with the retreat of socialism, that China's waging war on socialist Vietnam or backing genocide in Cambodia, were collaborating with U.S. imperialism and apartheid South Africa and Angola, thereby causing overstretching of resources in Moscow. None of this had anything to do with the tumultuous events of 1989 to 1991. So what Dr. Horne is basically trying to do here is to tell the audience that it is America's fault through its engagement with China, through negotiating trade deals with, or at least opening relations with China in the 1970s. It is America's fault that China outflanked the China grew out of the Soviet sphere, and eventually the Soviet Union collapsed. So this person is obviously a Soviet supporter. They have a Soviet ideologue on their show. I don't care if he's black or not. That's his belief system. So, you know, I guess, okay, you want to believe in the Soviet Union? Fine. You're entitled to your own beliefs. We have neo-Nazis in this country. The First Amendment guarantees their beliefs too. I don't have to like it, and I don't like it. I don't like your beliefs either. But let's watch his continuing hula hoops over how the KKK and gun control are somehow making America a more violent place today in 2017.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I wanted to get your reaction, your response to this this latest rally that happened over the weekend. You know, it made national headlines. The KKK, about a few dozen members, were greatly outnumbered by the anti-KKK protesters, the anti-racist protesters. The KKK was drowned out. They had a heavy police presence, and the police ended up using tear gas to disperse the protests against the KKK after the Klan rally had ended.
Remember this point at one of the next parts of this video. They're complaining that the police are using tear gas against protesters. Okay? Just remember that.
Give us your reaction to this, because Charlottesville has been a flashpoint in recent months, ever since the city council voted to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee. Richard Spencer held a torchlight rally there in the spring, which has been followed by counter-protests in the subsequent days. Give us your thoughts.
Well, you need to realize that Charlottesville, Virginia is a particularly sensitive site. On the one hand, it houses a college campus, the University of Virginia, and college campuses tend to have many people who lean to the left. In fact, I had a fellowship at the University of Virginia some years ago, and I remember that statue very well, being offended by it. On the other hand,
Hold on, you went to college for all those years, and yet, as offended as you were, you still graduated and you eventually became a college professor yourself. So what exactly is your point here? How did the statue impede you succeeding and persevering at whatever you did? I have over here this campus. I wouldn't go to the school, but it's a Catholic campus, and I don't believe in Catholicism. I never really saw it as an obstacle to my success, even though I had to walk through it very often because it was on the way to people's houses that I know.
Charlottesville, Virginia, more particularly the University of Virginia, is known as a site founded by a founding father, Thomas Jefferson, a founding father who many consider to be a sociopath, not least because of the intimate relationship he had for years with a slave teenager, speaking of Sally Hemings, while denying it during his lifetime. He's considered to be the sociopath in chief, and of course there's a saying in United States history that if Thomas Jefferson is wrong, then the United States is wrong.
So therefore, if we have child rape in Saudi Arabia, where a certain person back in the 7th century took a 9-year-old as his bride, and he was already married, then would you say that what's wrong in Saudi Arabia, what is done wrong by this certain person, not going to mention his name, makes Saudi Arabia wrong? I don't think he would ever say that statement.
Thomas Jefferson is certainly wrong, and many in the Ku Klux Klan and the ultra-right find that a very difficult pill to swallow. Keep in mind that this is the 4th iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. Recall that it had its origins in the early post-Civil War era, circa 1865, when the Confederate general Nathan Bedford Forrest, organized a Klan to terrorize the newly freed enslaved population, and particularly to deprive them of voting rights. Then it had another iteration in the World War I era when it broadened its remit to include anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism.
Both iterations were under the full support and cooperation of the Democratic Party.
And in fact, controlled a number of state houses and marched in the thousands, if not the tens of thousands, through the streets of Washington, D.C.
during the Democratic Convention of 1922.
Then in the 1960s, with the rise of the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, the Ku Klux Klan came creeping back and, of course, was known for executing civil rights protesters.
In that photo, they showed them supporting Barry Goldwater. And the majority of races, though, they actually supported Democrats in the South. Barry Goldwater came from Arizona, which wasn't really a very key state for the Ku Klux Klan. It's not even part of the Confederacy.
Protesters and demonstrators. And now, with the rise of Donald J. Trump and the so-called alt-right or white nationalist movement, the Ku Klux Klan has been given a new lease on life, and we see it rearing its ugly head once more.
So he had to make the connection to Donald Trump. Okay, so what does that have to do with gun control? So far, we've only been talking about racism, Confederacy. What does that have to do with gun control? So let's pick up with a brief statement he says over here, where somebody of his background says something very ironic.
The way of the dodo bird, that in fact it was now extinct. With regard to Robert E. Lee, he was a traitor to the United States government. That is to say, he was trained by the United States government to be a military officer, but in 1861, when the so-called Confederate States of America rebelled against the United States government, in order to overthrow the United States government and perpetuate the enslavement of Africans forevermore, he joined that inglorious cause. And
so, you know, I don't really disagree with him on that point, but remember, this is somebody who, his signature book is The Counter-Revolution of 1776, where he argues that the American Revolution really was not a revolution, it was a counter-revolution. What revolution it was countering against, I don't know. I'd have to read the book. It could be something pretty amazing. We'll leave it at that. But the other point that he tries to make is that Lee is a traitor against the country that he himself is blaming for destroying the country that he pretty much pledges loyalty to, the Soviet Union. You could see in his previous remarks, and I'll post the full text, that this was a full Soviet sympathizer during the Cold War. So who is he to judge anybody, regardless of the cause? I'm not saying that Robert E. Lee's cause was wrong, and I'm not saying that Robert E. Lee was an awful person or a good person, and I'm not saying that this guy is an awful person or a good person, but who is he to judge? He goes on to keep talking about the statues.
well, there is a Confederate statue that the city authorities are now trying to remove. In Richmond, Virginia, just down the road from where you are in Baltimore, there are enormous Confederate statues reaching to the sky, honoring these traitors, and certainly those statues too need to...
Again, with the traitors, I mean, if you're going to throw stones, don't live in a glass house. Okay, so he starts talking about how KKK members have not been prosecuted for violent crimes they committed in the 60s, and that, well, you'll see his bizarre logic here.
Away with murder. And that is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why you find these folks coming out to protest the removal of these Confederate statues, because they recognize more than most that if you can successfully remove these Confederate statues, you might be able to bring successful prosecutions, even against KKK killers who enjoyed and executed a reign of terror in the 1960s. So this is a very important struggle that's in...
Okay, he's trying to say that the KKK, if you can remove these Confederate statues, that finally we'll be able to prosecute these people, as if, first of all, there hasn't been massive KKK violence. I'm not going to say there hasn't been any, because then somebody would bring up something that happened, in North Carolina where somebody put, daubed some dog shit on somebody's door or something. So, and the definition of violence has been stretched, but there hasn't been KKK violence on a mass level in decades. The KKK is weaker than it's ever been. It's also been infiltrated by the FBI a number of times. And there have been so many people prosecuted in the KKK that it's not even worth, let's go into some of these people. I bet he knows about Edgar Ray Allen, who was convicted in, 2005 of manslaughter for the murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, 3 civil rights activists. You have Byron de la Beckwith Jr., who was convicted in 1994 for murdering civil rights leader Medgar Evers on June 12, 1963. So people get convicted. People get convicted. Okay, if you want to say that somebody did not get convicted that should be convicted, you should bring up names and not leave it hanging and make up some bizarre theory about statues being the reason that people can't convict them. And again, nobody talked about the riot that happened there. The Klan comes through, they do a stupid riot, or they do a stupid demonstration that where they wave their flags and people see their missing teeth and whatever, and that's considered massive hate crime against people. Let me tell you something. I hate the Klan too, but they are not growing. They're actually just as pathetic as they've been for the past 40 years. What you are doing is actually encouraging people to look at them as the underdog. And that's a real problem too. You should instead try to interact with them in a way that will show how ridiculous they are instead of showing how ridiculous you are. I've shown you before that the Real News Network uses the work of a reporter, quote unquote, from the Telesur network in Venezuela named Abby Martin. And they've interviewed her, they've featured her on the show, and they've taken her view pretty much hook, line, and sinker on what's going on in Venezuela. And I want you to pay attention to something. In the previous segment concerning Gerald Horne, they ignored the fact that the people protesting the KKK ran riot and ended up having to be dispersed by the police using tear gas. Well, what's their relationship to a regime that pretty much does the same thing but in different circumstances? You can see Abby Martin. This is her at a protest over in Venezuela,
which received wide coverage in the Western press. So I wanted to see the demonstrations that get virtually no coverage, those by government supporters. The atmosphere was quite different. I found the depiction of a widely hated government was a distortion. If Western media and human rights groups consider the voices of anti-government Venezuelans as golden, why are these millions of voices considered to have no value? The opposition's grievances...
They have no value because they're organized by the government. You can't be the voice of the people if you are supporting a dictator who has his poster put up all across squares in the country, and they're hailing his dead predecessor who had destroyed democracy in his country.
Are well reported. Who is to blame for what's going on?
Wow, el gobierno. Únicamente al gobierno. De verdad que sí. Queremos vivir, mira, queremos comprar libremente, nos tienen amarrados, la inseguridad, mira, antes se caminaba libremente, mira, esto es horrible, horrible, más que todo la economía, el trabajo, no hay trabajo, mira, yo soy una persona que trabajo turismo y mira, no sé qué hacer, dime qué hago, hacia dónde vas, no voy a vivir de un sueldo mínimo.
Yo soy una mujer que tengo 54 años y jamás había vivido una situación de tal naturaleza. E incluso siempre sentía que había injusticia, porque hubo cuando aquí llegó a haber un índice de inflación de un 100% anual en cuanto a los bienes inmuebles, que era lo que más subía en cuanto al mercado común. Nosotros sentíamos que la situación era difícil.
Nuestros derechos han sido vulnerados, no tenemos prensa escrita, no tenemos los medios de comunicación social están autocensurados por miedo, pues están sometidos, están doblegados.
As a member of the press, what's the worst thing that you've seen that's been like a repression on behalf of the military?
The censor, like the censorship.
So she does interview people in the opposition, and notice that the people in the opposition here don't assault her. Okay, that may have changed recently, but it's only because of the coverage that she gives, and you're going to see a little segment of that. This is a clip where they are gassed along with other anti-government demonstrators, and they end up giving
right
this
after
bizarre
I said
statement.
I didn't get hit hard with tear gas. We're running away, and you know, there's all these provocations with the police and the protesters, and they just started hurling tear gas canisters at us, and we were just...
Wait a second, I thought that during the Gerald Horne interview, the Real News, I mean, I can't blame them for rebroadcasting the Abby Martin shit, but look, I mean, in that one, you said clearly that it was the police that were being aggressors towards the protesters. In this case, what are you trying to say?
Caught in a huge plume of tear gas. It was extremely painful. My eyes are really, really burning. I felt like I was blind for like 5 minutes, so that just happened. While soldiers had cleared the freeway, protesters continued to block several intersections in the area, with more trucks and barricades. What I had experienced was a typical guarimba. A few hundred or less semi-armed protesters ruling the streets, shutting down as much as they can, using largely violent tactics. They push as far as they can go until security forces respond, then flee with new photos of repression. Given what...
So she's trying to make it seem like the protesters are ginning up the military and trying to get photo ops in order to appear as if they're being oppressed. Is that interesting? That's usually what the right says about Palestinian protesters, and that's kind of what the people say about these protests in America, where you have these protesters that come out and they make like a huge stink, they riot, and then they're trying to get photo ops. And that's basically, so you either have to call a spade, or you have to get the fuck out of the garden, in my opinion.
The media has been saying, I was shocked to learn that there were no arrests that night. It seems like there certainly is a right to protest in Venezuela. And
let's see how many people were actually arrested that night. So whether you want to believe Abby Martin or not, from Telesur, Venezuela's state media, it says on June 15th in Reuters that hundreds were arrested in Venezuela after the latest unrest over food. Venezuelan security forces have arrested at least 400 people after the latest bout of looting and food riots in the crisis-hit OPEC member country, local officials said on Wednesday. Another death was also reported in the state of Merida from unrest, which is breaking out sporadically across the South American OPEC nation. On Tuesday, violence engulfed the eastern Caribbean coastal town of Cumana as looters swarmed through dozens of shops and security forces struggled to maintain control. There were unconfirmed reports on social media of several deaths in Cumana, which is the capital of Sucre state, but regional government Luis Acuña from the ruling Socialist Party said those reported deaths were unrelated to looting. So they can only use state media. So if state media is the one delivering the statistics, then why are you analyzing, well, she goes on to do it anyway.
The curated images we see in the news are obscuring a much darker, deadlier reality. Since the beginning of the protest on April 6th through July 1st, we found 95 deaths attributed to the protests, with over 1,000 injured. Of that 95, 11 have unknown or undetermined connections to the protests and are murders that took place in the vicinity of a protest. So let's look at the remaining 84 deaths. It is true that many protesters have been killed by police and the National Guard. Several have been killed in shootings and 2 killed by tear gas. According to Venezuela's Attorney General, one of the most outspoken critics of the government's response, 23 deaths are attributed to state forces. Many investigations into alleged killings by state forces are still ongoing. In several cases, people were first reported in the media to have been killed by state forces, but evidence later revealed that they were actually killed by opposition weapons. But let's assume that
this is, by the way, that is basically an improvised gun used as like pretty much with a mortar mechanism. It doesn't even have a mechanism. So they're trying to say that the government, which uses that you saw them getting tear gassed in the earlier segment, they're not the ones causing it. It's these improvised weapons.
that number is correct, 23. So if only 23 out of the 84 are attributed to state forces, what has caused the majority of the deaths? The remaining 61. Those 61 actually have been caused by opposition protesters. Many of those killed directly in murders and political assassinations. Let's look at those numbers that so many unquestioningly attribute to state repression. We found 23 to have been indirectly killed by opposition violence in a variety of ways. For example, 6 people have died in vehicle accidents while trying to escape opposition barricades. 3 are civilians who died because opposition barricades prevented life-saving ambulances from reaching them.
So let's take that and project that to something else we've seen. I'll pull up an article. I won't show it on the screen, but I'll post a link. And you decide whether that really is to blame for on the opposition or not. Because when it happened somewhere else, they didn't really report it the same way. This is from July 13th, 2016. It says Black Lives Matter protesters block a bridge and delay a child's medical emergency. This was in Arkansas off I-40. It was in the aftermath of the Philando Castile and Alton Sterling shootings. And they're basically being prevented from advancing over the bridge. And there's this is from Fox 13 in Arkansas. I'll provide the link to that. So, I mean, did they blame that on BLM? Is BLM now causing the deaths of civilians because they block ambulances? I wonder if Telesur would report on it that way, and if the Real News would share that report.
9 of those 23 are opposition protesters who accidentally killed themselves. 1 in an explosion from an opposition mortar, and 8 electrocuted themselves to death while looting a bakery. In addition to these indirect deaths from opposition violence, 38 people have been directly killed by opposition violence. 16 of those 38 are seemingly random killings of civilians at opposition barricades or near a protest. 7 of the 38 are police and National Guard members killed by protesters. 6 of them were shot by protesters, and 1 National Guard member was beaten to death by a mob of protesters. One would think these...
So the Real News and Telesur, and I'm actually broadcasting, I mean, look, Telesur made this. The Real News does not go and post like a disclaimer that Telesur's views are not the views of the Real News. In fact, let's go looking through the page. Here's the entire text of this. It says the comments and whatever. It doesn't say anything about disclaimer. These are the views of, I mean, I can only assume that the Real News, by posting this video, shares the views of Telesur, which is the state media of Venezuela. And Abby Martin in a different video tried to claim, oh no, we're contracted by Telesur. We're not really Telesur. It says Telesur in your video at the top right corner. I mean, here. See that? See? Telesur.
Facts would be included in a fair report of force used by the state. But more heinously, 14 deaths are political murders and assassinations of Chavistas and government supporters by the opposition. Most were targeted for attending a pro-government demonstration or for being identified as Chavistas. 2 were socialist figures who were kidnapped, tortured, and executed. Most chilling was the lynching of 21-year-old Orlando Figueroa, who was brutally beaten, stabbed, and burned alive by opposition protesters. According to an interview with Orlando in the hospital, they yelled, "Hey black guy, see what happens to Chavistas," before throwing a Molotov cocktail on him and lighting him aflame. Orlando died from his injuries just days later. At least 4 other people have been set on fire but lived, allegedly for being Chavistas, and many others brutally beaten by opposition mobs. So of those 84 fatalities associated with the protest movement, 23 deaths are allegedly from state repression, and 61 deaths from opposition violence. As surprised as I was to see that the reality of these numbers is so warped, I was completely unprepared for what would happen to me for simply reporting these facts. Because I questioned the validity of the fatality count being 100% due to state forces, prominent opposition spokespeople created a false hysteria over an outrageous lie that myself and Empire Files producer Mike Preisner were not journalists, but in fact working directly for the government intelligence force.
You work for Telesur.
And that we weren't actually conducting interviews of protesters, but taking their pictures to turn into police forces. And not only that, but the police had then arrested protesters based on our intelligence. The life-threatening lie was first promoted by professor at Venezuela's Simón Bolívar University and opposition activist, José Vicente.
So suddenly these people believe that, you know, you can't, I mean, with all the crap that's happening in America, with people saying that, you know, to punch a Nazi and whatever and all that shit, now they're saying, well, now that all the protesters and violent people are coming to turn on us, this is wrong. They're threatening journalists and whatever. You work for state media. You're not just a journalist. You work for the state media. Telesur is owned by the state of Venezuela. In fact, because of the Venezuelan government, there basically is only government television media in Venezuela anyway. So what the fuck are you talking about? Maybe you should use a little introspection before you report bullshit like this. Okay, let's talk about why exactly they are being threatened by the opposition. It's not because they're journalists. It becomes painfully obvious when you see exactly what and how they are covering it. Let's look at this small part of it.
Prominent opposition journalists like Manuel Malaver and Miami reporter Angie Perez. The disinformation campaign incited a virtual lynch mob against us for days, which translated into real-life stalking and threats, calls to find and kill us, doxing of personal information, and more. Revealing their characters, scores of opposition Twitter accounts specifically used the word lynch when calling for violence against us. More than that, this opposition hate campaign also posted the address of an event Mike was speaking at, inciting...
So, this is an event that happened in Los Angeles. These are American reporters. They travel freely back and forth to the United States and Venezuela. And they're trying to portray it as an event where they want to speak about what the opposition is doing and whatever. But I'm going to show you a little on-screen segment of exactly, you know, who is the opposition, who these people are appearing before. I mean, why would the opposition go after them if they're only journalists? Well, let's look at some of the photos. This was posted by Abby Martin on June 4th. It says, KPFK does a great report on the event the Empire Files Mike Preisner spoke at that got threatened to be shut down by the Venezuelan opposition. Now, to be clear, this Mike Preisner is her partner. She's the one that, I think he's her husband too. And it says here, supporters and opponents of Venezuela's socialist government faced off in LA's Westlake district last night. The Party for Socialism and Liberation was hosting an Eyewitness Venezuela report from one of its members, Telesur reporter Michael Preisner. He had just returned from the South American country with Abby Martin, who hosts the Empire Files on the network. A group of Venezuelan Americans were tipped off to the meeting by a social media post that linked both Preisner and Martin to Venezuelan security forces. The group accused the pair of doing the government's bidding while on the front lines of recent street protests by identifying violent anti-government supporters, but Preisner said it was a farce. Preisner told the standing room only crowd at a room in the First Unitarian Church on 8th Street. The Venezuela's 1%er elites are angry that they've lost full control of the country and its economics over the last 2 decades. Well, I don't know who is in control of the economics of the country, but it sure as hell is not the elites. I'll agree with you, but I don't think it's the government either. While covering protests independently, although sympathetic of the government of Nicolas Maduro, he says waves of violent anti-government protesters surrounded them. They claimed affiliation with a U.S. cable network so as not to rile the crowd, so that he lied to them. I have no doubt, said prisoner, had they known we were from Telesur, they would have attacked and most likely killed us there on the spot. Prisoner said dozens of government workers and supporters have been brutally attacked and even burned alive, as a video circulated on Facebook Live showed recently. The young man, a government supporter, died of severe burns to most of his body. Outside the church gate, a boisterous crowd waved Venezuelan flags and signs targeting Prisoner and Martin. One protester held a sign that read, "No more lies, Prisoner and Martin." And before we move on, he's standing in front of a flag at the event for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So who the fuck is he kidding? This is not an objective reporter. You can't go on the internet and claim that you're being a reporter. Hold on a second. I am not going to make the case to you, as I don't care how dumb of a fuck you are, that I'm an objective reporter. I have clear biases, and I'm going to support who I'm going to support. I'm going to try to report the facts evenly, but this is not objective reporting. You work for the fucking government that these people are opposing. Okay, you're not objective reporters. You're not reporting. You can't even claim to report the truth if you're receiving a paycheck from the party that is trying to advance the very viewpoint that you're advancing, which is that the opposition is a lie. Of course the government is going to report that the opposition is a lie because they're opposing the government.
And worse. Dozens of Venezuelan expats actually showed up, chanting against socialism, and tried to physically force their way into the event to
Sounds a little like Cal Berkeley, doesn't it? Except now you're on the other end.
Disrupt it. But the threats of violence were not empty. Just days later, a Telesur journalist was actually shot in the back by opposition protesters when her and her team were viciously attacked with Molotov cocktails, bullets, and explosives. Many other journalists have also been called infiltrators and attacked, like when a Global Vision crew was doused with gasoline by protesters at a recent demonstration and told to leave or they would get burned. Amazingly, international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists have been silent on the attacks on journalists from the opposition and have only condemned the government for...
Well, one of the reasons they're condemning the government is because they've confiscated independent media.
Press repression. For as much as Venezuela's poor is used as the basis of the international media campaign to oust the government, the poor people from the barrios of Venezuela are not the ones protesting. The marches and violent guarimbas are concentrated in only a few states, where the middle and upper class areas are, most of them run by opposition governors or mayors.
That's because the poor are fleeing to other countries.
And the targets of the protesters speak volumes about the nature of the opposition. Factories, public transportation, Socialist Party offices, hospitals, and clinics have all been attacked. Even the childhood home of Chavez was set on fire.
Oh dear Lord, why would they attack the childhood home of this great man who fucked their entire country all the way back to some sort of real life adaptation of The Purge?
They've also set fire to the government's housing ministry, the Supreme Court, and more. In one case, a maternity clinic was raided, and the facility besieged by opposition forces for 2 days. A cultural center I visited, which gave free music lessons to youth and provided space for art collectives, had also recently been attacked and vandalized by opposition protesters. Ironically, even though protesters use food shortages as one of their main grievances, they frequently attack food distribution centers. Most recently, they burned a warehouse containing 50 tons of food intended for school children. The representatives of the opposition don't denounce the violent guarimbas sustained by the small contingent of protesters.
The man that is in the video was recently released from prison. He's the opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez. Hold on, I'll bring up his position. This man was arrested on February 18, 2014 and charged with arson and conspiracy. Murder and terrorism charges were dropped. Human rights groups expressed concern that the charges were politically motivated. His imprisonment was controversial. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which usually when you talk about Israel or the United States or Britain, the Real News really loves them. They said that they called for the release of those arrested in connection with the protests. Opinion polls in late 2014 showed that Lopez had become one of the most popular politicians in Venezuela following his arrest. In September 2015, he was found guilty of public incitement to violence through supposed subliminal messages, being involved with criminal association, and was sentenced to 13 years and 9 months in prison. He was transferred to house arrest on July 8, 2017 after being in prison for over 3 years. So what's this? The Real News, they have an impressive relationship with public protest. Here I got the shades on again. You know my stance on public protest. I do believe that people have the right to express their First Amendment rights in the United States. Of course, we're talking about Venezuela here, and we're also talking about the United States. Now, the Real News had such a problem with these violent protesters in a foreign country that are starving and where people are literally getting murdered on the streets, both by the government and by criminals. By the way, Venezuela's capital, Caracas, under socialism, has the highest murder rate in the world. That includes the Middle East. Thank you, socialism. So this policing addiction that you claimed was in Venezuela, in Baltimore, about a week ago. You said that somebody was protesting a police addiction. You don't think that Venezuela now has a police addiction now that you have protesters basically rioting and fighting the police day by day, attacking them, taking away their shields and guns and whatever? You don't think that's a sign of, what do you want? More police down there? Is that the answer? Because it's apparently in the United States, the police are the problem. But when you go to Venezuela, a country where they're impounding entire car factories because there's no money to pay the workers, you think that more policing is the solution. So the Real News is not on the side of public protest and freedom of expression or any of that. They're not on the side of the popular right to protest the government and to attain democratic representation. Because if they were, they wouldn't be broadcasting government propaganda from a regime that has confiscated independent media, right? The Real News, you claim that you're independent, non-profit media, yet you're broadcasting propaganda from Telesur, which is the propaganda media arm of the Venezuelan government in the English-speaking world. Why does Venezuela own a network? Here's a question, guys. Anybody from Qatar, why does Qatar own a network that broadcasts in English called Al Jazeera? Or why does Russia own a network called Russia Today? They want to broadcast their viewpoint to the Western world, which is fine. But you can't come to me, the Real News, and claim that you're independent media and then, regurgitate this bullshit from state media in Venezuela that paints the opposition as a bunch of thugs, which, I'm not saying that they're clean people, but, you're broadcasting your half of the story, which is that you love the government, you're supporting these two journalists, one of which is hanging out with socialist Venezuelan sympathizers with the Venezuelan government in Los Angeles. They're running away from the exiles, the refugees. They're running away from refugees in America who are protesting their brutal government in Venezuela. That's not the same approach you take with protesters from the Arab world who protest against the Trump administration, or protesters from Mexico that protest against the Trump administration, or protesters from the Palestinian, whatever you call it, independence movement that protests against the Israeli government here in the United States. It's not the same approach. So the consistency is lacking, the truth is lacking, and the real message is lacking. You don't believe in peaceful protest. You don't believe in independent media. And you just painted in a previous segment, I did the Horne segment, which I'm merging with this. You painted these KKK members that showed up and said their ignorant shit in front of a bunch of rioting protesters. You painted them as the problem. And I think that they are a problem, but rioting in Virginia is not going to end the KKK. And backing a socialist oppressive government in Venezuela is not going to end the massive riots from people that are starving. So I have to say that in order to see the real angle on this, you have to come to the For Real News, which is right here. Have a great weekend, everybody, and I will be trying to contact some of the people that were featured in this video, and hopefully you'll see some of it soon.